Hi everyone, welcome back. It's been a while. I recently played at the first SCGCon 10K event that they had this year in Philly, and I ended up playing Jeskai. I did pretty well, went 7-2 to a unfortunately 17th place finish, but the deck felt really strong, and I played slightly different card choices than some of the popular Jeskai decks that may be floating around online, so I wanted to go through my thought process on how I view the metagame right now, what I think is good and what I think is bad about Jeskai, and kind of take you down my path to the list I arrived at. And then this video will also be accompanied by a gameplay video that you're more accustomed to seeing on this channel with a 3-match set with a deck. So I will link those in a playlist, and hopefully you'll be able to watch that right after this or before if you don't care too much about the nitty gritty of the metagame and just want to see some gameplay. So anyway, let's start kind of at the beginning. So I wanted to play Jeskai at Philly because I thought there would be a lot of Delver and a lot of control. And I felt that the Jeskai deck in particular had a really, really good 4-color control matchup because it's the most proactive of all the blue mid-range checks, when you're playing kind of like a pseudo mirror, like that sort of thing, you want to be the one playing planeswalkers into play and being proactive. And so if you're playing like Teferi and Narset and your opponent is playing things like Uro or Endurance, you're definitely going to be the one coming out ahead in those exchanges just because of all the virtual card advantage and kind of just like presence you are putting on the board. And also, even though there's like answers to these planeswalkers with like Prismatic Ending, spending 3 mana to answer your opponent's 3 mana play at sorcery speed on your turn, and you still being down a card from that because the Planeswalker got value already. That's just a really bad exchange for you. So the best solution I found is, again, to just be proactive, and Jeskai was the best at doing that. So this is like kind of the list that I started looking at, or something similar to this, which got popular maybe like a month or so back now, with the idea of this deck is it's very all in on this combo of either Hullbreacher or Narset and Days Undoing, where you cast Days Undoing with one of these cards in play, and then you draw 7 cards, and your opponent doesn't draw any cards, and you kind of win the game from there. The big problem I found with this sort of deck was that the Delver matchup was really rough, where you are playing just like an incredible number of 3-drops. You have Hullbreacher is a 3-drop, Narset is a 3-drop, Days Undoing is a 3-drop, Snapcaster is like a pseudo 3-drop as well. Shark Typhoon, basically isn't doing anything until you sink 3 mana into it. So it's just a huge, huge number of 3-drops. So you were very vulnerable to getting like tempoed out and curved out. And then the combo itself was very fragile. You are kind of relying on this 3 mana blue card to sit and play against a deck with Lightning Bolt or Pyroblast. That's very ambitious, we'll say. So I wanted to mainly fix the Delver matchup while still having some consideration for other things that I thought might be popular, like elves and taxes, things of this nature. So that led me to the deck I will present here, which is a much more controlling version of Jeskai. You'll notice that the combo is shrunk down considerably. I only have 1 copy of Days Undoing and 1 copy of Hullbreacher, and then only 2 copies of Narset. So I've really cut down the number of 3-drops that the deck is playing because, like I said, I think that those combo elements, they let you high roll a little bit more, but you also low roll a little bit more, where you'll find a copy of like Days Undoing when you can't do anything with it, or you'll play a Hullbreacher and it will just die to Lightning Bolt, So I think in general in Magic, especially in Legacy, you win more games by raising the floor of your deck rather than by raising the ceiling. So I'd much rather have a much higher floor and slightly lower ceiling than, the reverse being true. So what have I put in place of these cards? Basically, a lot more interaction for creatures and just interaction in general and other forms of card advantage. So you'll notice there's the 4th copy of Prismatic Ending now. I've added a Supreme Verdict because I think it's really, really good against the Delver matchup, and is, like I said, also good against like elves and taxes, which I'm thinking will be popular, or thought would be popular. And then I also have 2 copies of Fire Ice. I think this is a really good flex spot where Fire is like really good against like a bunch of small creatures, and then Ice can be pretty good against like a big creature, like say they have a Murktide that you don't have an answer to. Tapping that down and drawing a card, it's basically like a Time Walk in a sense against a Murktide Regent, and can buy you the time you need to find your Teferi or your swords or your Pyroblast, whatever you need. Ice also interacts really nicely against like Urza's Saga, where Saga's on the first chapter. You can tap it in the upkeep, so it doesn't get to make a construct, and so Ice kind of becomes destroy a construct, draw a card for 2 mana, and that's a pretty good exchange. I've also playing some copies of Expressive Iteration because obviously, we don't need to be sold on this card. It's really, really good, and even though it's like sort of a 3 mana spell, it is, but it isn't in the sense that you get to play it and hold up mana still. So, say you play it on your turn 3 and you find a land off it, you get to play that land for turn, and you still get to hold up things like Flusterstorm or Pyroblast, which I found to be very important in like, the Delver matchups where, and especially in the Jeskai mirror as well, where if you like fully tap out for something, like say this Expressive Iteration was another Narset, and you tap out for Narset and then it gets countered by Pyroblast, you don't get to hold up a mana anymore for your interaction, and so what ends up happening is then your opponent gets to tap out for their threat, and then like you're behind the 8 ball now, and like you're the one on the back foot. Whereas even if they like were to Pyroblast and Expressive or Flusterstorm or whatever, if you still have a land drop for turn, you get to play that and then hold up your interaction, and so it's like sort of 3 mana, but you still get to hold up mana on your opponent's turn, and so I like that a lot more than just playing extra copies of these Planeswalkers. Additionally, I am playing a couple copies of Timeless Dragon, which has been performing really well for me. There's 2 main aspects to it. One is that like 20 lands in a control deck is kind of on the edge of what is reasonable, what's allowed. If you look at like some of these 4-color lists, they'll be playing, maybe 22 lands, or in like the case of the Dark Bant list, sometimes they'll even playing like 23 lands. And they'll also be playing things like Witherroom Command and Life from the Loam to rebuy these mana sources. And this works for them because they have Uro in their deck, and Uro is obviously an incredible source of card advantage as the game goes long, and is something to do when you're flooding. Without Uro, I don't think you can just play 22 mana sources in your deck. You're just going to flood out too often in the late game. Timeless Dragon is a nice solution to this problem, where it's like more virtual copies of a land, but also gives you something to do in the late game, as like a spell, either to eternalize from your graveyard, or sometimes to just cast the dragon half for 5 mana. And that's something I've liked a lot. Also, against Delver in particular, it is a 4 mana, 4/4 flyer that can't be countered, and obviously doesn't die to Lightning Bolt, which is really good because they play a lot of 3-power flyers. So it's just something you can do on turn 4. You don't have to worry about days. You don't have to worry about Force of Will. And it just like helps you lock down the board against the small things. And then this kind of lets you put more of your effort into dealing with Murktide Regent. Without Timeless Dragon in having access to it, you might have to, Swords to Plowshares like a Delver of Secrets or a Dragonite Channeler early on. Or you might have to Pyroblast a Delver of Secrets in like the early game because you don't know that you have this dragon coming. And then the Murktide might be able to slip through, and then you don't have an answer for it. Additionally, it is a nice kind of way to help you against Court of Cunning, where Court of Cunning really puts a lot of pressure on you into putting creatures into play that can attack and retake the monarchy. And also, it kind of helps against the threat of like the mill from Court of Cunning, where if they decide to start milling you, because that's how they win the game, it will mill you into a Timeless Dragon, and then you have an extra resource at your disposal, which helps fight back. So there's definitely been games where my Delver opponent milled me into a Timeless Dragon, and I got to like escape it and then steal the monarchy. So I do think it's a pretty solid addition in the deck for the issues I just talked about. One other quick thing is I cut the Karakas and put in a Mystic Sanctuary. I really think that Karakas is just people not adapting quick enough to the new metagame. There's no more Ragavan you have to worry about anymore. So, and you have no legendary creatures in your deck to bounce. So I really don't think Karakas is the utility land you want to be playing. I think Sanctuary is just better, both because it's an additional blue source and because like in the late game, just rebuying things like Expressive Iteration is very powerful. And it's also like nice with Narset, where it's like you can put whatever spell you need on top and then minus Narset and like guarantee yourself to find it. Also, if your Days Undoing gets countered, you can rebuy that. That's like a very common thing too, where it's just like your Days Undoing will get countered by like a Spell Pierce or a Flusterstorm, because you had Narset in play and we're starting to win the game. So it goes to the graveyard, you just fetch it with the Sanctuary, get it back. So these are some of the changes I've been making. I really like. Other than that, the sideboard is fairly similar to what I have seen in the other lists. I'll talk about some of the big changes. One is that I've added a mentor in the sideboard. This deck doesn't have that many ways to actually like close out the game damage-wise. You have 2 Timeless Dragons, you have a Hull Breacher, and you have a Shark Typhoon. And in theory, you have Days Undoing to like recycle your spells back into your deck, which does come up sometimes. Like if you cycle the Shark Typhoon early and the game goes really late, eventually you get to put it back in your deck and redraw it later. But still, I wanted one extra thing to bring back and pressure the board. And then Seven's Rec is a really nice add in the sense that this deck kind of struggles with enemy Pyroblasts, especially in terms of like gaining card advantage. So this being a card advantage spell that doesn't get hit by Pyroblast is very powerful. Card advantage in the sense twofold because it has flashback. So it's like you bring back one thing and later in the game you bring back 2 things ideally. And because the thing you're bringing back is like a Teferi or a Narset usually, and that itself is also a 2-for-1 inside of it. You can also bring back things like Dress Down if you really just need to cycle as well. So this has been like a really solid addition for me as far as like defeating Delver or like the Mirror. And then I have one Kozilek's Return here in like the spot where like Pyroclasms were previously. I kind of feel like Death and Taxes can be a tough matchup just because they have like good card advantage of their own and they have like exile-based removal for your creatures. So I wanted something that, because this is colorless, it gets around Mother of Runes. And I like that it's an instant because like frequently what will happen is your opponent will play out their stuff, and then at the end of their turn, you kill their entire board, and then you untap and you play a Planeswalker on an empty board. And I think that is a very, very powerful play pattern that you don't have access to with Pyroclasm. Pretty much everything else is the same. I guess I have one Mystical Dispute over maybe like a 4th Pyroblast. The thought process here being is that the red is kind of like your splash color, and you actually only have 2 red sources in the deck, 1 Vulcan, 1 Mountain. So there's going to be turns where your Pyroblast, like you have like another Pyroblast in hand, or you want it to like play expressive and hold a Pyroblast, and you don't have like all the mana to do that, all the red mana to do that. And Mystical Dispute is like providing a similar effect, but gets around that color restriction. And it's also nice that you can bring this in against like some non-blue combo decks, like Red-Black Reanimator, just as like a blue spell for Force of Will or just 3-mana counterspell, whereas Pyroblast obviously has no target there. That's something I want to test a little more. I'm not like guaranteed that this is correct or incorrect, but it's something that I'm keeping in mind. So that's kind of my thought in the metagame. I thought that Control would be popular. I thought the Devil would be popular, and that this build of Jeskai had a really good matchup against both of them. And then additionally, it has a lot of game against things like Elves and Taxes and like all the artifact decks with 2 copies of Meltdown. And then against the combo decks, you just have like a pile of Flusterstorms and Force of Wills and Pyroblasts and the Teferi and Narset passives putting a lot of work there. So I just felt like this was a really well-rounded deck. I really thought that trimming on the combo element of it and lowering the curve was a good decision. And I will jump into the set in the next video starting now.